Welcome to another episode of our Mixed Faith Marriage Mastermind discussion, where we talk about all different things related to being in mixed faith marriages. Today it's just Chris, Rich, and I. We are both in mixed faith marriages. We both work professionally with people in mixed faith marriages, and we are both on different areas of the belief spectrum. Chris is an active believing member. I am a non-believing but attending somewhat member. So we have different perspectives, different things that we bring. Our mixed faith families look very different. So hopefully, in the stories and perspectives we share, we're able to help you a little bit in your journey. So today we are going to dive into a question that comes up often in mixed faith marriages or mixed values marriages, which is, what do you do when you feel like your spouse is putting their beliefs or their values before your relationship? And I just want to say this can happen with the believing member and the non-believing member. So it doesn't matter where you are on the belief spectrum. You might put your beliefs and your values ahead of your relationship, and that can be problematic. It can be painful. So you might wonder, are they choosing their faith and values over me? Am I being asked to compromise too much of who I am? Is it possible to stay true to yourself while also connecting as a couple? So these are really tricky questions, and we're going to be sharing some of our personal stories. We're going to be talking about important distinctions and discussing how this all shows up in mixed faith marriages. So we're going to discuss this journey of holding on to your own identity and values while still being in connection with your spouse. And we're going to offer some thoughts on how to approach all of these difficult conversations around this topic, or how to handle it if your spouse feels like you're the one putting your beliefs before your relationship. So let's get personal. It's usually how we start. Chris, anything you want to say introduction wise or just to get going before we jump into this
I
topic?
think I'm good.
Okay. All right. Well, let's just share our own personal journeys with this. What has been your journey, Chris, with trying to figure out how to find this right balance or mix of prioritizing yourself and your own beliefs, being able to live your own beliefs, and also prioritizing your spouse and your relationship? Tell me what that's looked like for you.
Oh, it has been so messy, so very human and messy. In the beginning, I was going to say in the beginning, we really struggled with differentiation because I didn't even know what it was. I didn't know what that was for years. And I think having this idea that it was supposed to look a certain way and that we should be on the same page. I think also just I had a lot of expectations that we talked about on another one of our episodes that I thought it was his job to make me happy and that it needed to look a certain way. And there's definitely been a big learning curve. But I think as we've learned these things, I've learned a lot about me. It's definitely been a process of even knowing who am I? What do I like? What are my needs? And I think that's something that's a process that we're always figuring out. And I think it's I think it can be really confusing in a situation like this because we're always taught to put God first. And, but I noticed with me when I had to figure out what that looked like for me because I knew what it looked like before and what it looked like for us together as a couple. But then I had to figure out, when things started to look a little different, I had to figure out what that looked like for me. And I think there were a lot of times, I'm going to just be vulnerable and honest here. There were a lot of times where when I would put, it was like, I'm going to put God first and it needs to look this certain way. And a lot of times when I was doing that, I didn't like how I was showing up because I got really judgmental. It was like I got really self-righteous and that my way was right and his way was wrong. And I didn't feel like I was following God when I was doing that. So it's definitely been a messy, confusing process. And now that I've done this for, a couple decades now, I feel like it's really helped me to figure out what are my beliefs? Where do I stand? Who am I? What are my priorities, my needs? So it's been a very messy, growing human process.
I think messy is a good way to describe it. That's been my experience too. it's a process. It's hard to figure this out. I think for me, well, I have tended to be on the more people-pleasing side in the past. And so I think initially my kind of go-to response was just to prioritize my husband, prioritize the relationship, kind of not really kind of bring out my own beliefs or prioritize my own views or myself in that way. And that's gradually shifted over time as I've learned how to be more healthy in the relationship. So yeah, the messiness for me has been learning to put a little bit more of myself into the relationship, prioritize myself while not neglecting the relationship, right? Doing both. And so that has looked like me being a little more outspoken sometimes or standing up for, hey, no, this is what I think we should do for our kids and for the family. So yeah, messy. Messy is a good way to describe it, to sort it out. So I'm sure listeners are probably in the messiness of this also. We have a lot of compassion for the messiness of it all. All right, let's talk about some different differences between this idea of like, what does it mean to put yourself first in your marriage? What does it mean to put your spouse first in the marriage? What does it mean to put the relationship first? Is there a difference between putting your spouse first and putting the relationship first? And what about putting God first, like you had mentioned? So let's just disentangle those a little bit and talk about the differences between them. What are your thoughts on any
Yeah,
of
I
those?
think this idea of putting yourself that question, I think it can get tricky because if I'm thinking that I'm putting him first, then that means that he should be putting me first. And
Mhm.
I think this can get kind of messy because how do you even define that? What does that even mean to put someone first? And how I put someone first might look very different than how I think they should be putting me first. So I think it's really important I think it can get a little sticky in that area. I know that's I think it's important to realize that my definition could look very different than my partner's definition. So I think this is definitely a good thing to communicate on. Also, I think how you were just a minute ago, you were saying like you had to kind of figure out how to learn to be you. And I I think I may put my partner first because I want to make them happy or because I feel like I have to, like I go into people pleasing. But I think it's important to recognize that I don't want to do that to make him happy. I want to do that because that's who I want to be and how I want to show up. Because then you start keeping score and it's really hard to keep score and it's never going to work out in marriage. So I think it's so important that instead of trying to, if I want to put him first, I want to do that because that's who I want to be and how I want to show up. So I think it's really important that we're careful with that. And I know for me personally, that when I put God first, that's where I personally feel like I'm showing up as my best self. But I think there's a big distinction between putting God first and putting the church first, too. There's so many different definitions of how this all looks. Because I know like when I put God first, I feel like I show up as my best self. And when I'm doing that, I feel like I'm more likely to be more loving to my neighbor and myself. And I feel like that's where I show up with compassion and empathy, not only for myself, but also for the people around me. And I feel like I take a better care of myself and when I'm putting God first. And I think another thing with that, I feel like when I'm really putting God first for me, and once again, this is my experience in my marriage. I know doesn't work for everyone, but I feel like God wants me to have a great relationship with my husband and with my children. And when when I remember that and I'm putting him first, then I feel like I show up as a better mom, as a better wife. And so it may look, I think just that definition of what does it look like to put God first can make a big difference. I think when I feel like I'm showing up as my best self, that's when I feel like I am putting God first because that's probably a little convoluted, but that's how it works for me.
No, I love that. And I love, you brought out how like these are conversations you might need to have and even to sort out within yourself. Like you said, what is putting the relationship first look like? How do I define that? How do I define putting myself first? I love your, I when I put myself first, I'm doing things that help me to be a better person so I can show up in the relationship. So if that, I think that's a great way to put yourself first. So yeah, I liked all of the way that you thought about that. So I would think about this in terms of like, whether I'm putting myself first or my spouse first, a lot of time that's about short-term gratification. Like I'm putting my spouse first so that he's happy and then everything's comfortable and fine, right? That's like short-term gratification. Or I'm putting myself first because this feels really good in the moment to do this thing I've been wanting to do. Short-term gratification. Putting the relationship first, I feel like is more about like long-term sustainability. Like what does this relationship need in order to last a long time? So it might need like sometimes it might need a little bit more give and take from me. Sometimes it might need more consideration about my spouse's experience. Sometimes it might need me speaking up more because it's not going to be sustainable. I'm just going to grow resentful if I don't insert myself more in the relationship. So for me, I think now I'm thinking about this after hearing you, Chris, as I'm thinking about how I would define putting myself first or putting my spouse first, I think I would define it as, yeah, what do I need to do for myself to thrive in this relationship? And how do I need to show up for my spouse for them to thrive in this relationship? I think that's how I would define like putting self first, putting spouse first, it for the goal of long-term thriving in the relationship versus just short-term gratification. I guess I focus more on yeah. I don't know if that makes any sense because
Yeah.
that was
I think too, there's this idea that we don't want, if we have this idea that if we're putting ourselves first, that it's selfish. And I think I don't love that. Because if I have an empty tank and I'm not taking care of my needs, I'm not going to be able to go and be the wife I want to be or the mom so I think just the terminology with that is so, so, so important that we're commanded to love our neighbors as ourselves. That implies that we do love ourselves, that we're taking care of ourselves in a way that we can love other people. And I think that's where we do end up putting the relationship first in it, just like with what you were saying.
yeah. So I think if we're talking about beliefs, am I putting my beliefs, am I prioritizing my beliefs over the relationship, or am I are my beliefs helping me to show up to the relationship
Hmm.
better so that this can thrive long term?
Yeah.
Or is the way that I'm interacting with my beliefs helping me to create something thriving? And is my spouse handling their beliefs in a way that's also allowing a thriving
Hmm.
relationship? But yeah, yeah, it's
I
not about
love what you said right there is the way that I'm interacting with my beliefs.
yeah.
Because sometimes we can have beliefs that, it's like, oh, I'm putting God first. I'm supposed to be doing this. But then we end up not showing up as not being very Christ-like or kind. So I love that is the way I'm showing up with my beliefs. I love that question.
And then I think, I don't believe in God in the way that I used to as a believing member. If I was going to talk about God, it would be in like form of a higher power. And to me,
Yeah.
relationship is a higher power. It's like the higher good, something beyond just myself. And to me, God is relationship, right? So
Mm.
prioritizing God is prioritizing relationship with others in, spouses, family, and, putting that first involves balance of how am I showing up? Am I showing up in a way that is helping the relationship or hurting the relationship? Yeah.
I love that. And it made me I know we're going to talk about this more, but it made me remember it was like, okay, I feel like I love general conference. It's important to me. I love listening to it. And I remember there were times where I'm like, this is what I'm going to do. I need to put God first. But then my family would come in and then I would get like, hey, I'm listening. They were older and I realized like I was putting conference first, but then I was being kind of snippy and rude. And it's like, wait a minute, that's not what this is about. That's not, and I've caught myself many times where it's like, oh, I'm doing the right. I think you have to be careful. What is the right thing? And checking in so it took me some time where it was like, nope, I'm doing this. I'm dead set on watching conference. And now it looks different when I can still watch conference anytime I want. If my husband says, hey, do you want to go for a walk right now instead of, hey, I'm trying to listen to this, leave me alone. It's more like, yeah, I'd love to go for a walk and I can come back and watch conference. So I'm not giving that up. I'm still hanging on to that. And I'm looking at I'm trying to show up as who I want to be in our relationship.
Yeah, I love that. And that me to the next question, which is like, what are the specific ways that we see this in our practices and in our own lives? This kind of feeling like, oh, like your beliefs are taking priority over me, or your values are taking priority over the relationship. Where do we see this? Where do you see this?
Oh, so many places. We could talk for hours about this. And I think it's so important to recognize, for me, I think I'm getting better, but I was so black and white. It needs to be this way or it's wrong. And it's not. And I think that's a really important part of personal revelation because I thought my family was going to look a certain way and it doesn't. And I'm still trying to live those principles and those things are important. But so how do I do it now? So many examples. I was thinking of like with Sunday. In the beginning, when my husband was out and my kids had all decided that they weren't interested, it was like Chris Rich goes to church every Sunday. We don't do sports. I was still like really rigid in what that should look like. And there got to be a time where it was like, wait a minute. I'm doing these things, what I thought, and I'm putting this in air quotes, the right thing, but by hanging on to my religious practices, but then I wasn't spending time with my family. They would go to the soccer game together, and I had to really stop and, what is important here for me? Is it, because part of religion is family. So it was messy. I love the question. I'm going to say this a million times. Who do I want to be? How do I want to show up? Because my family looks different than a lot of families. My husband's a big runner. He loves to run, and a lot of times his races are on Sunday. So, in some weeks it's, I'm going to go to the beginning of the race and then I'm going to head to church. And sometimes it's just him. Sometimes it's just, I think a lot of times it looks different and figuring out what does that look like. Yeah, so many. Another example, there are so many examples. Tattoos. I have a family member that got a tattoo and I didn't love it. And they knew that. And I kept hanging on to that. Like, this isn't how it's supposed to be. This isn't how it's supposed to look. And recognizing I gotta figure this out because I can always judge them and keep going and hanging on to that, or I can give that up because I don't think that's not healthy either. So a lot of it is just checking in with yourself. Who do I want to be? How do I want to show up?
I think
So,
those are good examples I see a lot of too. Sundays for sure. Word of wisdom, like how can they drink when they know that I don't want them to do that? They're putting their beliefs before me. Or yeah, they go to church instead of family time. Sundays, word of wisdom, conference, those are all big ones where you might feel that they're putting their beliefs. And I love the examples you shared of how you have navigated it.
mhm.
With me, I'll give some examples of kind of how I've tried to navigate some of these areas. So, with Sundays, like if it was up to me, I would just not go to church. I don't value it anymore. But I've decided I want to be generous in the relationship and I want to be caring about what my husband values. So I don't feel like I'm prioritizing the relationship and that I go, but not in a way that's self-sacrificing. Like I've carved out a way to attend church that works for me. And, I don't go all the time, but I do make an effort to go sometimes. And that's a way that I value the relationship, but I don't feel like I'm compromising too much of myself. I've found a way to do it that works for me. So that's kind of Sundays. Word of wisdom, I have grown to like coffee, but my husband doesn't. So I could just be like, well, it's my body, my choice. I get to decide. I could show up like that, like prioritizing what I want to do, but I value the relationship. So I want to show up as someone who's considerate of what my husband likes and doesn't like. So I want to be generous and considerate. So I really like chais and matcha and those kinds of things. They don't smell up the house like coffee, so that's my way of being considerate. And I like iced coffees because they don't smell up the house. I don't need a coffee maker that's constantly that reminding my husband that there's coffee in the home, right? So that's just a way that I have like I can still hold on to myself and do these things, but I'm doing it in a way that's really respectful and considerate and generous so those are just some examples. I do have a tattoo. I got a tattoo, but I was again, I wanted to show up as someone who's considerate and respectful. So we talked about it and I actually thought about it for a year. I like initially talked about it and I was like, I'm not going to do it right away. Let's talk about it and again in a year and see how we both feel about it so that we've had time to think. So I waited. I wasn't like in a rush, like I have to do this now. It was more like, yeah, like I care about what you think and what feels comfortable to you. So I'm not neglecting myself, but I'm always doing things in a way that's like caring and considerate. At least that's what I try to do. And I've had to grow into that. But all these areas, word of wisdom, Sundays, all of those things, it tends to be where these kind of like, do I prioritize myself or do I prioritize my spouse or how do I prioritize the relationship? And I've had to learn how to do that.
Yeah,
You,
definitely. And I think too, for those of that are listening, these are just two of our experiences. Are there ways to have a coffee pot in your home? Absolutely. Are there ways to this? These are just the things that two ways of looking at. So many different ways. I think it's important to
absolutely.
understand that.
Good point. Because everybody's relationship is different and what matters to each spouse is different. And yeah, great point. All right, so let's talk about how to prioritize yourself in this way that's like you said, who do I want to be in this relationship? How do I have a good, healthy sense of self? So it's common for couples to feel like their spouse is prioritizing their beliefs over the relationship if their spouse doesn't agree with them. Like, oh, you don't want to do things you want to do things your way and not my way. You must be prioritizing your beliefs over mine. So, can you prioritize the relationship and still disagree? Can you say no and still be prioritizing the relationship? Like, what does it look like to disagree and still prioritize the relationship? That's kind of a tricky question. What are your thoughts?
I love this. And this has been such a learning curve too, that I know I'm still on too. What has worked best for me and for us? If I take care of me and he takes care of him and the things that he wants to do, then we just get to come together and love each other. And that can look really different. And I think some other examples. So I know and I have a lot of clients that they want to go to the temple, but they feel like they can't go to the temple because their partner doesn't want to go. And I think it's really important to look at what is important to me? What are my needs? And for me, going to the temple is a big deal. That's something that I want to do. And I don't want to punish me by not going to the temple because he's being him. So I think that's really important to look at, our own needs. And are there other ways of doing it? So either I go by myself or I go with a girlfriend or I go with a family member or someone from my ward. So looking at, making sure that I am fulfilling my needs. And I know we've talked about this before. I think of that it is my job to be the general contractor of my needs. And instead, a lot of times we put that responsibility on our spouse. And that's not something he wants to do. I don't want to put him in charge of that. So, and it's not something that I want to give up. So I've found other ways of doing that. Another example on the flip side of that, when he had stopped going to church, we were in Salt Lake and he loves to ski. And I was devastated because he wanted to ski on Sunday. He wasn't asking me to, but he wanted to go skiing. And I was just, I was devastated and I had some emotions to work through with that. It was different than I planned on. But one thing that really helped me with that is that I wanted him to live my religion. And that wasn't working because that's not, skiing on Sunday was, that was not what I was doing. But and recognizing that was very helpful that I am trying to hold him to to the things that I valued and just checking in. So sometimes I'm kind of funny about it with myself, like, oh, there I go, trying to make him do it my way. And, and I think that was helpful too, so going back to that idea I shared, if I take care of me and my needs and he takes care of him and his needs, then we just come together and then we can enjoy each other. And and that our needs look very different from each other. So that's what has worked for us. Will that work in every marriage? Probably not, but that's one way to look at it.
Yeah, but I love that of like we can still prioritize the relationship even if we have, if we disagree on about what's healthy and what's appropriate. I think prioritizing the relationship looks like what you shared, just consideration, always respect, generosity, acceptance. I feel like those are things I talk to couples a lot about generosity in relationship. Like those are ways you can prioritize the relationship without having to neglect yourself or your beliefs. Is am I always being respectful and considerate and generous and yielding and warm and forgiving and accepting all those things. Like when we're doing, I feel like that is prioritizing the relationship, even if you disagree and say, well, here's how I want to do things, or it's important for me to do this, but I still want to be really respectful and considerate and collaborative and work with you to find something that is sustainable for us. So I feel like the skiing example you gave was a good one of that, like prioritizing the relationship and being accepting and not, judgmental and caring, but allowing space and being considerate and collaborative.
And I think
And yeah,
too, there are times, and this has definitely evolved over time, but like to me, I don't go shopping on Sunday. But if he says, "Hey, I'm running to Costco. I would love for you to join me." In the beginning, I would have been like, "No, I don't do that." And then I realized that wasn't, I felt like that wasn't working for me over time. I realized like, no, I do value our relationship and I do want to spend time with him. So do I personally go shopping on Sunday? No. But if my husband says, "Hey, do you want to join me?" I do want to hang out with him. So I go hang out with him.
yeah, and that's such a collaborative approach of like I can still honor myself. And I think this is what we're always working towards in this is how do I honor myself and be the kind of person I want to be and engage in relationship and be respectful of what my spouse who's a different person. How can I be collaborative with them? So that's a great example of that balance of finding like the I and the we at the
Yeah.
same time.
I remember there was one time he had a company party on Sunday, and I was like, "Oh, we don't do those things on Sunday." And I was so uncomfortable with it. And then I was like, okay, so yes, this is on Sunday. The Sabbath is important to me. And I feel like God wants me to have a good marriage and to support my husband. And so it was like, okay, I think God's still I could be totally wrong. I could be totally wrong, but I don't think so. I think that we have to look at our different families in this situation, and it looks different than other families. I think the big underlying thing is personal revelation. Like how does this look for me? What does this, and my mixed faith family looks different than yours, and ours are going to look different from other people. I think just using that and checking in with what does it look like to support my spouse, to show, and I love those words that you shared, to be generous and what'd you say, generous and
Oh,
respect.
considerate, yeah, respectful. Yeah, those are words I'm often using in couples work. So, differentiation is being different, unique individuals, but that can also stay connected. And that requires so much generosity and consideration. Like,
Mhm.
I think if both people are just putting themselves first, like, yeah, they're being their own individuals, but they're not working on the connection piece. And the
Yeah.
connection piece is the collaboration, the generosity, the consideration. Like, how does this impact you? Maybe I could do it differently so the impact isn't as hard for you.
Mhm.
Just so much consideration, so much care, collaboration.
And that takes practice and time and screwing it up too. So,
Yeah. And a lot of mature, like growing in maturity.
yes,
I've had to grow up a lot
me too.
to not think about just yourself and to think about how does this impact the other person and could I do it differently? Can I let go of some of it? And, can I hold on to parts of it and also yield parts of it? It takes a lot. It's not
Yeah.
easy. So, okay, let's talk about what to do what do you do if you feel like your spouse really is prioritizing their beliefs over the relationship, that they're maybe just that maybe they're focused on not compromising themselves, but then they're really not connecting in the relationship, what do you do? What would you do? What would you advise people to do?
Well, I'm always going to throw in the nervous system
Hmm.
to make sure part of regulating if you want to have a good conversation with someone, you want to go into it with a regulated nervous system. And we've talked about before your prefrontal cortex, that CEO part of your brain. It can be a lot, your conversation's going to go a lot better if you have your prefrontal cortex, that part of your brain that can help you think clearly, articulate, make decisions. If that part of your brain is functioning, things will go a lot better. If it's not, it's going to not go so well. If you are in that, if you feel like you're in survival mode and needing to protect yourself. So, for example, if you're, let's say that you feel like your spouse isn't, they're spending a lot of time doing something else. You could go into it, like being defensive, like, you never hang out with me. I don't like that you do this, and pointing fingers and blaming and getting defensive. That looks so different than, I miss hanging out. I would love to spend time with you. And there's a very different feel to that. So when we're in survival mode, we're gonna be big and fierce and wanting to fight. And if we can step back and go into it with using our prefrontal cortex, that's where we can be curious and compassionate, where we can connect with each other and to, have empathy. So that's where it's, instead of like you're doing this, it's, help me to understand, what does this feel like for you? We can go in with that curiosity and compassion and trying to see things from their perspective. When, if someone says, hey, you're always doing this, I always like to look, is there a kernel of truth to what they're saying? Is it true? Maybe I am spending a lot of time with my calling. Is that true? What could I do to make things, is there something that I can do that would be more respectful, or, like you were saying. So using I messages, this is how I feel, just stating the facts instead of, like, this is what I'm observing, this is what's going on, and this is how I feel about it. And how do you feel about it?
Yeah, such important things, important skills. And I would add to that, when you prioritize the relationship, sometimes that means doing uncomfortable things, right? For the good of the relationship, in order for this to last, I have to speak up because otherwise I'm going to be
Mhm.
growing in resentment and then I'm probably going to lash out or I'm going to the intimacy is going to erode, right? So just part of, if you want to prioritize putting the relationship first means sometimes doing really hard things that you don't want to do, which might be speaking up and saying, hey, this is not working. I feel like you're putting so much time into your calling, or I feel like you're so rigid about your Sunday attendance that there is no room for me in your life on Sundays or whatever it is. But, bringing up the hard things so you can work it through, that is, in my perspective, that is prioritizing the relationship. That means you value it enough to have the hard conversations. Okay, so what if you're on the receiving end? What if your spouse is telling you, like, hey, I feel like your beliefs are taking precedence? And remember, this can be non-believer beliefs, which, or believing beliefs. They're both belief systems. But what if you're on the receiving end of that, of your spouse saying, hey, like, you're not taking me into consideration enough, or you're not prioritizing our relationship enough? What do you do with that?
I think that's where, and that would be in a situation like that, it's so hard not to get defensive because, when someone points a finger at you, so I think that's where making sure that you are doing your best to stay regulated, and I think it is important going back to that idea I just shared a minute ago. Is there a kernel of truth? Is there something about this? And instead of taking it personally, like, this is where we get curious. Help me, thank you, like, thank you for sharing that with me. Can you give me an example of how I'm doing this? And, trying to be open, and that can be hard. That can be really hard. But I think and finding, instead of trying to defend ourselves, to really ask, to get curious with them and try to understand things from their point of view, I think can be very helpful. Not
Yeah.
easy, but helpful.
No, none of this is easy. That's why it's
No.
so messy and there's a lot involved. In fact, right before we hopped on this, you and I were like, there's so much in this topic. Like, this is going to be hard. So, we're just glossing over some ideas, but maybe some of these ideas will be useful in this kind of journey to find a healthy sense of I and a healthy we in your relationship. That's kind of, if you don't have an I, then it's hard to have a healthy relationship. But you also need the we, where you're caring and respecting each other. And it's a messy process to get there for sure, an ongoing process. Any other thoughts you have, Chris, about this topic? Anything else you want to share?
I think my favorite word is and. There, I mentioned earlier, it's so easy to be black and white and to so for me, my family and my faith are my top two priorities. And to just remember that and this, and it doesn't have to be this or that. It can be this and that. But that takes some creativity, some trial and error, some practice, a lot of coaching, therapy, using the tools that, and this wasn't easy. I did not get to that point where this has taken me years to get to this point where I can have that. And I think one of my favorite questions to do that in order to have both of my priorities to be able to be there. What does love look like? What does love look like in this situation? And it doesn't all, and I look at that. What does love look like for myself? What does love look like for my husband, for my kids? What does love look like for God? And it doesn't always look the same. In one situation, it might be the one answer. In another situation, it could be something totally different. But that question I think is so helpful. What does love look like right now? And that can help me so I can have both. I don't have to put one over the other. I can still have both.
I love that. Yeah, I would just add, I think we can become dogmatic in our belief system either way. We can become dogmatic against the church. We can become dogmatic in the church. And then there's just not room for the relational skills of empathy, curiosity. Like you've mentioned curiosity a bunch, and that's so important for creating this sense of prioritizing the relationship that you got to be curious and collaborative, these C words, curiosity, collaboration, consideration. When we're too dogmatic, no matter where we are in our beliefs, then maybe we're not kind of prioritizing the relationship enough. So just always good to kind of check yourself of, yeah, what am I prioritizing and how am I doing that? What does love look like? I love that question. So
And I think one other thing I was just thinking of too, it's so easy to make our decisions in a very black and white way. And I like to think of, so I do value the word of wisdom, the law of chastity, all those things, those are values that are important to me. And there's my favorite word. Sometimes I have to look at, okay, do I value the word of wisdom more than connection with my child right now? And I can still live the word of wisdom or what that looks like. And right now, I'm going to prioritize the connection with this child over having a conversation about the word of wisdom. So, looking at which do I value more, the relationship or the principle? And I wish it were black and white, but there's a lot of times it's not. So, it's using that. What does love look like? What would love do in this situation?
yeah, maybe that's a good way to sum it all up. There is no black or white. There's a lot of different ways to do this of finding out how to hold on to yourself, how to hold on to your relationship, how to care about your spouse, all and God and all at the same time. So, all right. Well, thank you. And hopefully you'll join us next month for another conversation about mixed faith marriages.
Thanks, everyone.